Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Rob Hilton, President and CEO of the McGregor Foundation. It is my privilege to introduce the first speaker in our series on aging in Northeast Ohio, founder and CEO of Encore.org, Marc Freedman. What if I were to propose to you that Northeast Ohio is one of the best places in our nation to enjoy the experiences of midlife and beyond? The purpose of this series is to explore this proposition, showcasing some of the remarkable resources that define us officially as an age-friendly city. McGregor's co-sponsors in presenting this City Club series are the Benjamin Rose Institute on Aging, Hospice of the Western Reserve, and Judson Services, Inc. I'm sure that you are all aware of the demographic horror story of the largest ever generation of Americans, known as the Boomers, moving past age 65 and then having the audacity to live longer than any of our predecessors. Typically, this story is presented as an insurmountable challenge. But what if, rather, this megatrend represents a great opportunity for both the individuals involved and our country as a whole? What if the Boomers become net givers to society rather than takers? Those of us in aging services, philanthropy, and academia regard today's speaker as the high priest of this increasingly influential line of thinking. Marc Freedman is founder and CEO of Encore.org. Through fellowships, storytelling, and educational programming, Encore.org encourages the experience, wisdom, and energies of boomers in solving social problems to create a better future for the generations that follow. Mr. Freedman has questioned conventional American views on aging since the 1990s. He played a central role in establishing Experience Corps, now AARP Experience Corps, mobilizing thousands of individuals over age 50 to improve the academic performance and prospects of low-income elementary school students in 22 U.S. cities. In 2005, after establishing Encore.org, Mr. Freedman spearheaded the creation of the Purpose Prize, an annual $100,000 prize for social entrepreneurs in their 60s who have made an impact on a major social problem. In its 10 years, the Purpose Prize has awarded more than $5 million to nearly 100 winners and honored over 500 change makers in Encore careers. Cleveland joined the National Encore movement in 2013 when the Cleveland Foundation launched the highly successful Encore Cleveland to help mobilize a network of organizations to provide experienced Greater Clevelanders with an array of meaningful opportunities throughout our community. Encore's Purpose Prize is a model and inspiration for the Cleveland Encore Prize, now in its second year. Nominations are now open, and you can learn more through Encore Cleveland's website. Mr. Freedman's Encore experience has led to numerous formal prizes and citations as one of the world's foremost social entrepreneurs. And in his spare time, he has authored 5 books about aging, volunteerism, and the value of experience, and fathered 3 sons. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, members, and friends of the City Club, please welcome Mr. Marc Freedman.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks to the City Club. It's such an honor to return here, to return to Cleveland, where I started out my career as a summer intern at the Cleveland Foundation in 1983, reminding me once again of the passage of time. I also am very grateful to be part of this initial program for the Aging series. I live in San Francisco now, and I commute over the Bay Bridge. And for the last several years, as I commute over the bridge, I invariably wait for many, many minutes in traffic. And it seems like the traffic grinds to a halt just in front of a large billboard from a financial services company that I won't name. But the billboard says, "The first person to live to 150 has already been born." And then the tagline is, "Prepare for a longer retirement." So when I got home the first time I saw that, I went to the website of that financial services company and saw that they hold the age 65 as retirement age. And then I did a little math and realized they were talking about an 85-year retirement. Now that is a scary proposition. I've spent my whole career working in the nonprofit sector, and I'm not sure I can handle an 85-year retirement. It's a scary proposition for the country as well. You know, we're working so hard to extend the length of lives. In the Bay Area where I live, a lot of people are trying to make that 150 number a reality. Google and AbbVie have combined to form a company called Calico. They're spending billions of dollars to radically extend human lives. Peter Diamandis, the founder of the X Prize, and Craig Venter, who sequenced the genome, have started something called Human Longevity with a similar goal. There's now a $1 million Palo Alto Longevity Prize for whoever comes up with this great breakthrough. And I wonder what a society would look like if we continue to innovate in extending the length of lives, but do far too little to make the most of those added years. In fact, JFK at the very first White House Conference on Aging, all these decades ago in 1961, said that we'd added years to life. Now is time to add life to those years. That was over half a century ago, and if it was true then, it's certainly true now. And if we fail to, it's a dystopian prospect. No wonder we celebrate on one hand this great gift of longevity, the extra 30 years we've already added to the American lifespan in the past century. And at the same time, when you pick up the editorial pages, you hear about this gray wave of greedy geezers about to take America to the cleaners, to bankrupt posterity. It's almost as if FEMA is sponsoring the entire demographic revolution, the age quake, the gray tsunami. So I'm here today to propose an alternative. Some alternatives are already out there. Christopher Buckley, who wrote Thank You for Smoking, wrote another book called Boomsday, which proposes euthanasia for boomers at 70. So that's one way out of the dilemma. Even the wonderful film, The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, I've read interviews with the author of the book that was the basis for that movie, and the whole idea of that book was that society hates old people. So what about outsourcing them? It's not a prescription she endorses, but they're moved to India in that film, and it turns out to be an optimistic film. In fact, there's a wonderful moment when Penelope Wilton, who's spent her entire life savings on a photoshopped image in a brochure of what the Marigold Hotel retirement community is going to look like, and arrives there to discover this kind of collapsing mess, and accosts Dev Patel, the star of Slumdog Millionaire, who's the proprietor of the Marigold Hotel, and she wants to know why she didn't get her money's worth. And he said, "Oh, don't worry, everything works out in the end." And he said, "And so if it hasn't worked out, it's not yet the end." So maybe that's true for us. Maybe Google and AbbVie and all these places, they'll extend life to a century and a half, and it'll all work out in the end. But whether that happens or not, I think we need to be more proactive. And I think that starts with a radical rethinking of aging, a radical rethinking of this period that's opening up between midlife and old age, which is, for many of us, a very confused time. I discovered that when I turned 50 and went on a car trip up the Pacific Northwest, and I was trying to save money. And I got my first senior citizen discount at the Homewood Suites in Medford, Oregon. And I was so proud of myself. I was crowing about my financial acumen to my wife, who reminded us that we had 2 small children at the time and that I should have asked for 2 cribs in the room. So I had to call back the 18-year-old clerk at the Homewood Suites. And I got him on the phone. I said, "This is Mr. Freedman?" He said, "Oh yeah, Mr. Senior Citizen Discount." I said, "Can I have 2 cribs in the room?" So But we hear, right, 60 is the new 40 or the new 30. There was actually a poll a few years ago to determine once and for all whether it was the new 40 or the new 30. And at the same time, you're getting senior citizen discounts at 50, maybe 60. So it's the old 80. At the same time, it's the new 40. We hear about the young old, the working retired. I mean, maybe we should just decide that these are the oxymoronic years. I remember, the little giant when I was in elementary school, and these other contradiction in terms. The main message I wanted to deliver today is that 60 is not the new 40 anymore, than it's the old 80, that 60 is the new 60, and that this period that's opening up between the middle years and anything resembling old age is actually a new category, a new stage of life, and that this population explosion of all of these boomers and Gen X's as well now that are coming to this period are pioneers on the frontier of a period that doesn't even yet have a name, but is one of the largest groups in American life, and it's going to be an ongoing shift. And so you might be saying to yourself, a new stage of life, that's blasphemous. You don't just cook up life stages any more than you design a season and add it between fall and winter, right? I mean, these are eternal verities. But it turns out that life stages are fictions, not fixtures. They're things that we make up over time to make the life course make more sense, particularly as we keep extending the life course. And that was a lesson that I learned almost 20 years ago when I started trying to understand the history of retirement. We were creating Experience Corps. We were trying to call older people to action to serve the next generation. And it was abundantly clear that we were going against the grain. That we were telling people, instead of focusing on leisure and recreation exclusively, essentially having a second adolescence, a second youth, that they should be focusing on young people. And many people raised their hands, but we were a little out of step with the norm at that time. So I tried to understand, how did we get this idea of later life as a second youth? It's a very recent phenomenon. It's something that we concocted in the last 50 years to solve a problem, and it really all started in 1935. We invented Social Security, one of the great triumphs in American history. We picked 65 as the definition of old age and the eligibility age, based to some extent on the Prussian military pension of the 19th century. Otto von Bismarck had sort of picked that out of a hat so that the state would never pay a pension. He was, I think, 77 or 78 himself at the time, and so he didn't count himself, amongst the rest of humanity. But John Chauvin, who's an economist at Stanford, said we'd never use $1935 in 2016 without adjusting them for inflation. No self-respecting economist would ever do that, yet we use the 1935 definition of being over the hill as if it was some kind of eternal truth. It became evident that we were already on a slippery slope in 1940 when the first Social Security check was given out to a woman named Ida Mae Fuller in Vermont. She went down to the local post office, picked up her check, and proceeded to live to 100. She paid $20.75 into the system and got $22,888.92. And I always feel compelled to add the 92 cents because she was a bookkeeper. She saw the Beatles come to America, the moon landing. And I say that not to make a lot of the money part, because I'm as you can imagine from my earlier comment, a huge fan of Social Security. But things were already starting to change. In 1948, when Walter Reuther, the great UAW leader, got up in front of his union in Milwaukee, he described retirees as too old to work, too young to die. This limbo land, kind of with no purpose in life. Lewis Mumford, American sociologist, a few years later said, at no point in any society had any group been so rejected as older people today. And this was a problem for older people, obviously, but also for the insurance companies who were trying to sell pensions to people who did not want to think about this period of life. And in a remarkable period of a few years in the late 1950s, we changed all of that. This was a time in the 50s when the country was infatuated with teenagers. Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers had the hit song, When Do Fools Fall in Love, in 1956. We had actually just concocted the word teenager. It was an era of youth, and a guy by the name of Del Webb, who founded Sun City, the first large-scale retirement community in America, came up with the brilliant idea that in a country that's infatuated with youth, why don't we reinvent later life as a kind of second youth? He coined the phrase the golden years. He summoned people to an age-segregated community, Sun City, in a godforsaken cotton field in Peoria, Arizona, outside of Phoenix, set to open on January 1st, 1960, to have an active new way of life. And it was based on very little market research, and there was great unease. They spent millions of dollars on this project. On New Year's Eve, 1959, Webb and his lieutenants are sitting around a Mexican restaurant in Peoria, Arizona, and everybody's in an anxious mood. And finally, the director of sales said, how am I ever going to sell a 30-year mortgage to somebody who's 65 years old? And they thought, oh, maybe we should have thought of that before the millions of dollars got invested. And they went home and they tossed and turned. And the next day, 100,000 people showed up. There was a traffic jam for 20 miles leading into Sun City. If you build it, they will come. At a time in a country where there was no place for older people, no place to be older, they created a place where, because everybody was old, nobody was old. And you could live out this fantasy of a second youth. And it caught on, and they built it, and people came, and they kept coming, and they've come for decade upon decade. And this idea of the golden years has become a sort of central part of the American dream. People started retiring earlier and earlier to get to this shining image on the hill. True of adolescence itself, the first youth. I mean, one of the most amazing stories in American cultural history is how we got that first idea of youth. Just after the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, there was a proliferation of young people who weren't children and who weren't adults, and we were scared to death of them. We saw them as having physical maturity but emotional immaturity. It's a time of urbanization, industrialization, much immigration. There was a general unease in the country, and a psychologist by the name of G. Stanley Hall, the father of American psychology, first PhD in psychology in the country, founder of the American Psychological Association, founder of the American Journal of Psychology, the person who brought Freud and Jung to America. He had Freud, Jung, and William James in a little brick house in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he was president of Clark University, and they were studying the occult. You can't make this stuff up. If that house had burned down, all of the collective unconscious, American psychology would have been wiped out. In 1904, before he became president of Clark, Hall wrote a book called Adolescence, and essentially put this, at the age of 60, this new stage on the map. 20 years later, he said, I made a big mistake. I should have never invented adolescence. And boy, did he know. He said, I should have invented a new stage of life between midlife and old age. And he was a poet. He had graduated from Williams College, where he was class poet. And he said that this period in life was an Indian summer. And he said that human beings didn't reach the height of their capacity until the shadows started slanting eastward. And I thought a lot about that. And I think what he basically said is that this beautiful intersection between time lived and time left to live was what so many people who were hitting that period were experiencing. All the benefits and wisdom of experience, the time to do something with it, and then the perspective and motivation that comes with knowing that there are fewer years ahead than there are behind, that the road may go on, but it's not going to go on forever, and you realize that in a way that you don't when you're an adolescent or 20 years old. So fast forward almost a century from that period, and I think it's time to embrace the ideas that Hall articulated all those decades ago, partly because we have to do things differently. The current arrangement is unsustainable. We can't afford an 85-year retirement or even a 40-year retirement on working for 40 years. That's unsustainable. We can't afford a country with a quarter of the population, essentially an enforced leisure class. We can't afford this balloon payment of leisure saved up till the end of life. It doesn't make any sense from a sustainability perspective, and who wants to be an oxymoron for a period that could be as long as midlife in duration. At the same time, for all the concerns, there's an absolutely extraordinary opportunity here, one that you could think of as an experience dividend, only comparable to the movement of so many millions of women into new roles in the 60s and 70s, this absolute windfall of talent. Well, we're seeing the same thing in this group. Of course, it's the same women who are moving into this period of life. And what's so interesting, and I think it reflects on Hall's ideas of the Indian summer and the shadows slanting eastward, purpose is such a defining goal for people who are wanting to contribute in this period in life. We see it in the Encore career movement. We describe Encore careers as second acts for the greater good, and we know Jimmy Carter's doing that, and Bill Gates and Mayor Bloomberg, all these famous people, but it turns out that below the radar, 4.5 million Americans are already in these second acts at the intersection of passion, purpose, and a paycheck. 21 million more say it's a top priority to do exactly what these pioneers are doing. The average length of time for these second acts is a decade. And if you add all that up, which is a little bit challenging for me, I could handle that 150 minus 65 equals 85, but it's 250 million years of human and social capital that is represented by this group of people who already want to have be a Jimmy Carter in their own community, essentially, to use their experience. And they don't want to reinvent themselves. They want to build on the skills that they've already acquired over all of these years. We still have a lot of work to do to realize this potential. Partly, we have to come up with a name for this period. I was scouting around for prospects, and I encountered my mother-in-law over a laundry hamper. She'd come up to help us out with some childcare, and I said, Donna, she's very good at doing crossword puzzles and autodidact. What should we call this period? And she said, I've been thinking about that a lot. I'm talking to my sister Pat about it because she's in this stage of life. She said, I'm on my next to last dog. The way she figures it, she had about 7 years left in her current schnauzer. And if she got a mid-size, she could probably get another 15 years. And we're used to measuring life in dog years. So I think she had kind of cracked the code there. I got terribly worried, though, because the dog died. So I went to Tom Pearl's website. He's the leading expert on centenarians, and put in all of the information I knew about her life. And it said she was going to live to 97. So I relaxed, and I called her up to celebrate. She went and did the same thing and came up with 96 and informed me there were things about her life that I did not know and perhaps should not know. I think the key beyond figuring out the equivalent to next to last dog is, by the way, Hall called this stage of life senescence, which is probably why it hasn't caught on 100 years later. But we need to marshal the social innovation that's equivalent to the innovation in things like life extension that's already underway. Because I think life extension without social innovation equals dystopian disaster. And it is time to add life to those years, not just for all of us who are living longer, but for our communities where we'll all be living. That starts particularly on the transition from what's last to what's next, which is a do-it-yourself improvisation for so many people. We need a gap year for grown-ups. I'm convinced. Malia Obama just announced she's taking a gap year, which I think is great. I wish I had done that myself. But what about our parents, right? They've been working pretty hard. Look at Barack Obama's hair after 8 years in the White House. Why doesn't he get a gap year? And why don't all of these parents, who've been killing themselves and working extreme hours? Mostly we need a transition period. If we're going to have another life of another act of contribution, it's hard to fumble into that without the kind of support that, for example, we provide young people. I think we need internships for grown-ups, right? Just like Robert De Niro showed us all this year in a film that was made for, I think, $35 million and is gross close to $200 million. At Encore, we have something called the Encore Fellowships Program, which is a half-time fellowship for grown-ups. One of the shining sites is here in Cleveland as part of the Encore Cleveland initiative. We need to have a new kind of education for the second half of life. And I'm not talking about traditional lifelong learning, as valuable as that is. Harvard and Stanford have each started one-year programs for people who want to navigate this passage from what's last to what's next. And for a mere $60,000, you too can participate in those programs. They're great programs. They're worth every penny of that, but I think we need to democratize school for the second half of life. It's happening already in some ways. There's a doubling of people over 50 going to divinity school. Time magazine talked about this a few years ago with the title Holy Enrollers. Whoever wrote that got to take a gap year. But it describes a woman who went from being a pediatric nurse in Florida to being an Episcopal priest. It cost her $100,000. She had to sell her house and her car and essentially take a vow of poverty, which is fine if you're going into the priesthood. But we need to come up with much better ways to finance. So we've got this transition. We've got individual retirement accounts. What about individual purpose accounts? What about being able to take a year of Social Security early to have your gap year and then just work an actuarially adjusted period later? Before you got full benefits, you'll probably notice that none of the 60 and 70 some presidential candidates of all parties have been talking about any of this stuff. They seem to be having an encore career themselves, but have very little in the way of policy prescriptions for ordinary people to follow that same course. If we do all this, if we rise to the demographic and longevity occasion, we can turn the longevity paradox, good for those lucky enough to live longer with enough money, bad for society, into the payoff for everybody it deserves to be. And I think, and I'll close with this, I think we can do something even more than produce a windfall of talent and richness in one's later years, add life to those years in JFK's wonderful words. I think we can produce a cultural revolution that gets us back to where we started from, which would be a good thing to do. And I think I just want to close with this impassioned appeal. I'm not even sure I can find the right words to articulate it, but we went wrong 50 years ago in trying to turn later life into a second youth. We need to embrace our age, to embrace the wisdom of this Indian summer, and do what older people have done time immemorial, which is, instead of trying to be young, to be there for those people who actually are. We rerouted the river of life, and we need to return it to its natural course. That's going to be good for society. It's going to be good for older people. George Valent, one of the great American psychiatrists at Harvard Medical School, who's done the most important longitudinal studies on happiness across the life course, has found that older people who mentor younger people, who invest in the next generation, are 3 times as likely to be happy as those who fail to do so. And he says biology flows downhill. It's human nature. And if it's human nature, if biology flows downhill, shouldn't society flow downhill as well? Shouldn't we get back to that cycle of life as we grow older, we accumulate this experience, but we come to realize that mortality is part of life, that we invest in future generations. Erik Erikson said, I am what survives of me, that was the hallmark of successful development in this stage of life. William James said something very similar. He said that the great use of life is to spend it for something that outlasts us, and to return to that wonderful house in Worcester, Massachusetts with James and Freud and Jung. I want to read you something that Carl Jung wrote in 1932 from an essay entitled The Stages of Life. He said, "We cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie." And it reminds me of a Greek proverb, society grows great when older people plant trees under whose shade they shall never sit. Society is growing gray, and it's going to grow ever grayer. Will it grow great? If we take these words to heart, if we quit trying to be young and be there for those who actually are, I think everything will work out, not just in the end, but in time for all of us boomers and those generations coming quickly on our heels. Thank you.
I'm Dan Moulthrop, CEO of the City Club of Cleveland, also a proud member. Today we're enjoying the inaugural forum in our Aging in Northeast Ohio series, featuring Marc Freedman, CEO of Encore.org. I feel obliged to say that if lifelong learning and engagement is your passion, it's our purpose. If you can't swing a gap year, we think you'll find lunch affordable. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests and students, and those of you joining us via our webcast. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will work it into the program. We want to remind you, too, that your questions should be brief and to the point. Holding our microphones today are Content Associate Teddy Eisenberg and Marketing and Outreach Specialist Faye Walker. May we have the first question, please? I'll do it. I'll ask the first question. All right. So, Marc, do you see how I did that? Just came over here. It feels like you have a lot more to say about where you ended your speech regarding how you envision the aging boomer generation interacting with the younger generations. And I wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about kind of specifically what you think the boomers could do.
Yeah, maybe I'll. We once had a speaker come to our Purpose Prize conference to give a 7-minute talk, and he started out saying that he was going to begin by summarizing 10,000 years of human history. He had gotten to about 3,000 years of human history, at the 20-minute mark. So it's a great pearl that I'll actually try to answer your question by going back many millions of years in human history, and then I'll zoom to the boomers. But there were anthropologists, evolutionary anthropologists, who question why women live beyond reproductive age in a harsh evolutionary sense. They were all men, as you might have suspected. And an incredibly wise anthropologist at the University of Utah, Kristen Hawk, set out to answer that question, and she studied a series of hunter-gatherer tribes, and essentially to look at the role of grandparents, grandmothers in particular, and discovered that the role of grandmothers was what enabled, among other things, both parents to hunt and gather, which led to the extended gestational period, which separates human beings from all other species. And the punchline is essentially, grandmothers are what make us human, that we would not have survived or developed as a species if this was the case, if it hadn't been the case. I started all this work from the youth perspective. I worked for 15 years for an organization focused on kids, particularly got interested in mentoring for kids. Became abundantly clear that mentors and caring adults of all types could play a profound and important role in the lives of young people. But all the programs at the time, we did the first big study of Big Brothers Big Sisters. At the time, there were 70,000 kids in Big Brothers Big Sisters, 30,000 on the waiting list. And the question was, where are the human beings to do those things that only human beings can do? And if you thought about that question for a while, just in terms of numbers and time, they're in the vast and growing older population. That was the seed for Experience Corps, which has flourished here in Cleveland. But what I've learned since then is that not only are older people numerous and relative to other segments of the population have time on their hands, but as I was saying earlier, this generative instinct that grows in later life, the biology flowing downhill, is a reason why so many older people have the instinct to do this. But research by Laura Carstensen at Stanford, and has a theory of socio-emotional selectivity, kind of takes it to the final step, which is that as people grow older, she finds, and that sort of time horizon shrinks, what do people focus on? They don't go out and study, ancient languages. They focus on relationships. This impulse to relationship really grows, and people are at their absolute best in terms of emotional regulation and relationship skills at this stage. So all that is basically to say, if we were to go to a whiteboard and hire McKinsey to invent a population that could help develop young people today, especially in societies where there are fewer and fewer young people and we're more and more dependent on them being successful, it would look a lot like the older population. But instead, we've been telling older people to pretend that they're the kids, right? Now we need to let nature run its course and to help it in every way possible. And I think we can not only enrich the lives of older people, but really create a better future for future generations. And at Encore, we're going to be launching this fall the Generation to Generation campaign to mobilize 1 million older people to stand up and show up for kids, to fight inequality in the next generation, and to discover the true fountain of youth, which is not trying to be young, but to be there with young people. Now that was a very brief, pithy response. That pretty much takes care of the Q&A period. Sorry about that. Hi, Peter.
Mark, can I just thank you for being here again and also build on that. Aging is changing, and the perspective of intergenerational aspects of it are, I think, part of what you've been saying. There are huge challenges, though, that our world faces. And when I look at some of the discussions about the future of aging and search for things like climate change, and that and income inequity are both huge challenges. You address the income inequity indirectly by saying, well, you know, it's harder for some people than perhaps people in this room. But I do want to bring climate change into this occasion, into this hall. So how can we channel this positive energy that you're so articulate at bringing to bear on kids and on a thought about the future and the quality of the environment that our children will be living in?
I think those are the two big issues. There's a new and wonderful book out by Michael Kinsley, Old Age, a Beginner's Manual, which is really not so much about old age, really about this period beyond midlife. And he talks a lot about legacy, and he has a wonderful line in there. He said, we should care about legacy because we're dead a lot longer than we're alive. I somehow found that to be an optimistic statement, which may say something about the way I think about things. But if we are, and I think so many people in this period of life are discovering that they have the opportunity not just to leave a legacy, but to actually live one, to make that idea part of the fabric of their life. And there's a beautiful TED Talk that I'd recommend on that subject by David Brooks that went into his book, The Road to Character, but he talks about resume virtues and eulogy virtues. You know, we live our lives so much by piling up this resume, but when you think of that versus what people actually say about you at your memorial service, are we really serving that goal? And that tends to be about relationship and leaving the world better than we found it. And I'm really heartened by the upsurgence of a number of groups that are mobilizing older people around climate change. And they all tend to have the title, gray is the new green, or graying green. And so it does, on one hand, it seems paradoxical, right? Why would people care about the future that they'll never see? On the other hand, it's the essence of really embracing later life. So I see parallel movements forming around the well-being of younger generations and climate. And I think it's a right moment for that because, you've all seen the kids versus canes headlines, old versus young, this media trope. It is completely and utterly false. Pew Research did a study 2 years ago that shows that we're actually in the golden age of generational relations. They've never, in all the years they've been measuring, found such affection between boomers and millennials, between older people and younger people in the context of families. And so I think we're really at a great moment to extend that kind of intergenerational connection and love beyond families into communities. Hi.
You hold it. My name is Vivian Miller, and I work at Career Transition Center. And I've got a little crackly voice today, so I apologize for that. What we do is prepare people for their job search. Our demographic is 50 and older, but we find ourselves getting people in who are in their 40s who feel that they're pretty much washed up in the job force. And I'm wondering how we can impress on employers to be more open to the idea of hiring people who have wisdom, they have expertise. And I keep saying age is only a number. I just graduated from college last year. Give me a break. and I'm just getting started. So I don't know how to, I keep trying to infuse our clients with hope. But on the other side of that, I feel a degree of sadness that the world out there just isn't more open to what we bring to the scene. And do you have any suggestions on what I as an individual or even as our organization can do to make the other side of the fence sort of more open to what it is that we're sending out there in an application situation or an interview situation? Just give us a chance.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is just that this is the experience of being a pioneer. I'm moving to a period where the goal was the freedom from work to one where so many people are aspiring for the freedom to work in new ways to new ends. And it takes a real psychological toll being a pioneer. I interviewed a guy a few years ago who'd actually been hugely successful in his midlife career. You would think he would have all the confidence in the world, but he'd been ousted at age 60, and his company sent him to essentially be reprogrammed. They sent him to one of these transition programs for executives, and he formed this group of people who were going through the same experience, and that was the best part of the program. And he said they'd even given themselves a name. And so I said, well, what do you call yourselves? He said, the Pip Squad. I have little kids. I know about Pip Squeaks. He's previously important persons. And they were all, came of the Gladys Knight era, so they loved that. And he said they had a mantra, too, which is the world may be done with us, it's just we are not done with the world. And I think, I hear that in everything that you're saying. And it is this kind of all dressed up with too few places to go issue is such a powerful barrier. You can make the business case, you can do a lot of things in the rational arena. What we've found, for example, through the Encore Fellows program, that one of the best ways to change employer attitudes is essentially the Trojan horse. If you create incentives to get this source of talent in the door, people suddenly realize that they have been missing it all along. I remember we piloted the Encore Fellows program in 10 organizations in its first year. And at the end of the year, 9 of the 10 organizations offered jobs to the fellows because they couldn't bear the thought of losing them, partly because they were also mentoring the executive director of the organization by the end of the year. So it was personal as well. So I think that, it is just a tough time. It's just like it was 30 years ago when women were moving into new roles. There's so much headwind. But I think one of the keys is getting people in the door, finding ways to do that, because I think that'll have a real dividend. Thanks.
Hi, Mark. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's been great. I'm curious, this is not an issue that's unique to the United States, and so I'm curious if there are other societies, Western or non, that have great examples of engaging older adults that the United States can pull from, and if so, what are the lessons that we can learn from those examples?
Well, I'm so glad that you asked that question. The United States is actually a relatively young country compared to particularly Europe and Asia. I think Germany, Italy, Spain, South Korea, and Japan will have between 40 and 50% of their population over 60 by mid-century. So this is not a subtle shift that, erudite demographers are picking up. This is a wholesale societal transformation. And yet, despite those kinds of profound shifts, I think there's even less innovation going on elsewhere than there is in the United States, which is a cause for real concern. I feel like one of the great counterexamples came earlier this year when Singapore announced a $3 billion plan to become kind of the world's envy of making the most of an aging society by, I think, 2030. And what I loved is that it was filled with common sense ideas. It wasn't an arcane document. It was essentially a 10-point plan to do things that were already working at the scale commensurate with the need and the opportunity. And there were things that even as simple as co-locating child care centers and senior facilities. Things that we've been doing more and more in the United States, a major service corps. And I feel like that's a huge opportunity. I invoked JFK earlier. He asked the boomers to think what they could do for their country. Why not make that appeal again as people that the Peace Corps was invented for in the first place reach this period in life? A major investment in education for the second half of life, in retooling programs, in providing dignity for the elderly. So I'd love for us to even be debating a plan like the Singapore plan. It'll be different for the United States, but I don't really even see a robust disagreement. It would be great to have an argument about these issues, but none even exists.
Yes, I'd like to give a very brief example and then a question. The example is that my granddaughter, about 4 years ago, said to me in the presence of her mother, she put it this way, she said, "Gramsy, what's it like to have more years behind you than ahead of you?" Her mother immediately pulled her aside and said, "Don't ask your grandmother that kind of a question." And my question to you is there writing being done for how we should deal with grandparents and young people? Because the fact of the matter is, to have them be truth tellers is a plus, not a minus. And it's the middle generation that needs to think about maybe those young people can help their grandparents in ways they haven't thought of.
Well, I think there's such a natural connection between grandparents and grandchildren. When you think about it, it's one of the most revered relationships in society, not just American society. And yet we're at a situation because of geographic mobility that so many people are nowhere near their grandparents. I've been a big fan of the foster grandparent program, which was created during the War on Poverty and places older people one-on-one with young people, 20 hours a week, all low-income older people. And I feel like that idea, which was actually concocted by Sergeant Shriver at a time when LBJ was concerned about the high poverty rate among older people, but was being barred by Congress from doing any more income transfers. So they essentially created this program as a ruse to get the equivalent of the minimum wage in the pockets of low-income seniors, and it turned out to be a brilliant piece of social innovation. And yet, all these years later, I think it's 25,000 people. What about a national legacy corps that called the older generation to be societal grandparents, not just in their own family, but for kids across lines of age and oftentimes class and race? I'd love to hear one of the candidates again articulate that kind of call to action. And I think all those folks in the middle generation could learn a lot from that too, since they're going to be in that position quicker than they realize. So anyway, I feel like this could be the golden age of grandparenting, but in the modern family sense, not just within your clan, but in your community.
Just to go one step further from what you were saying, I think we could learn a lot from the immigrant communities in terms of grandparents, right? Because they're very good in terms of staying at home and raising the children while the parents go out to work, and they could provide a valuable resource in terms of imparting knowledge of their old country to the young people and teaching them a language. What do you think of that?
I think it's a wonderful idea, and I think that there are great ways to involve immigrant elders with young people who are born here in ways which can help the older people adapt, learn the language. At the same time, provide global awareness for young people. So this past year we did a fast pitch contest at our annual conference, and the winner was a program from one of the most highly regarded ethnoburbs, which is Fremont, California, where the Area Agency on Aging has been bringing together elders from immigrant communities with young people. So I think there's a lot of lessons to learn and a lot of opportunity for cross-cultural bridging as well.
Thank you very much, Mark. I have worked with the elderly for 25 years in recreation therapy and saw how intergenerational programs, specifically art and music, have worked with having children come in from preschools, the neighborhood, into retirement communities such as Judson Manor. And also, I saw at Downton Abbey, one of the last of the series, where I believe it was either Mary or her sister said, purpose. And when I turned 70, I turned 75 this spring, I said, I need to continue purpose because I have volunteered for both two Cleveland Foundation organizations, which they didn't ask me to promote, but I will, is Benjamin Rose Institute as the encore artist, and also with the Cleveland Foundation support for the encore program with Cleveland Metropolitan School System, the True to You program, and seeing that when I turned 70, I wanted to know what purpose do I have. And so when you said passion, purpose, and paycheck, it really it rang a bell with me. So I would say if you're looking for a logo, is purpose people, that we could be purpose people. So I hope that made sense. And thank you very much for the Memorial Society for hosting part of this that I'm a member of. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just close by saying our organization, our founding board member was John Gardner, who was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under Lyndon Johnson, who founded Common Cause and who won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964 when he was in his late 50s and was actually on the brink of doing all the work that he would be remembered for. And I met his grandson last year, and he told me that when John was in his last years, he had above his desk a 3x5 card. It was the only thing that was on the wall above his desk, and on it was one word: purpose. And maybe I'll close with a quote from John, because he was the person who implemented Medicare and in many ways did as much for older Americans as any person in the last 50 years, and also came up with the Experience Corps idea. During the battles over Medicare in 1965, John said that America today faces breathtaking opportunities disguised as unsolvable problems. And I could think of no better benediction for everything we've been talking about today. Thank you. Okay. Thanks.
Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a forum featuring Marc Freedman, CEO of Encore.org, and he's also the founder there. Today's forum is the first in our Aging in Northeast Ohio series, presented by the McGregor Foundation with support from the Benjamin Rose Institute on Aging, Hospice of the Western Reserve, and Judson Services. We thank you all so much for your support. We also want to extend gratitude to our community partners, the Cleveland Foundation and the Cleveland Memorial Society. We thank you very much for your partnership, as well as guests at a table hosted by AARP Ohio. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to also say that our next forum in the series is October 13th. Mark your calendars. That will be out at the McGregor House in East Cleveland. We hope you'll join us for that. It's in the late afternoon, not here at the City Club, and not at lunch either. So that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Freedman. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Our forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.